The events that led to the Battle of Midway started here in 1941. The island of Oahu, part of Hawaii, today America's 50th state and one of the world's most exotic holiday destinations. Back in the 1940s, US servicemen counted themselves lucky if they were posted here. In early December 1941, with only 15 shopping days left till Christmas, the people of Oahu were taking it easy. After all, the United States was at peace, not yet actively involved in the Second World War. But the world as the Americans knew it was about to change beyond all recognition.
Just 300 miles to the northwest of Oahu, a fleet of warships was bearing silently down on this island. America was about to be propelled into World War II. Heading unseen for the Hawaiian island of Oahu was the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy. This armada had departed from Japan in absolute secrecy and crossed 4,000 miles of the Pacific Ocean under total radio silence. They did not plan on being detected. This battle fleet was the most powerful naval force ever to put to sea. It had been sent to attack the United States by the hardline military government of Japan. The Japanese were set on building an empire in Asia and the Pacific, and were willing to use force to do it. By late 1941, Japan, here, was already in control of Korea, and was engaged in a long war for control of China. It also set its sights on the European colonies of French Indochina, British Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, roughly present-day Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The Europeans were absorbed in a war against Germany, so the only thing standing between the Japanese and their vision of empire was the United States Navy, and in particular, America's main naval base in the center of the Pacific on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. The name of the base? Pearl Harbor. This is Pearl Harbor, one of the finest natural harbors in the world. Here it is on the map, on the south side of the island of Oahu, a narrow channel from the Pacific Ocean opening up into a huge sheltered anchorage. The harbor was the perfect haven for America's Pacific Fleet. By December 1941, it was busier than ever, with nearly 100 ships at anchor, 8 of them battleships moored up on Battleship Row, all of them engaged in the relaxed routines of a peacetime navy. But that peace was beginning to show signs of strain. The Americans were wary of Japanese expansion, and tensions were beginning to mount. In a show of strength, they had transferred more of their warships from the west coast of America out here to Pearl Harbor, to be 2,000 miles closer to Japan. And it was the massing US Pacific Navy that the advancing Japanese strike force was intent on destroying. The approaching Japanese fleet included battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. But at the heart of this armada were 6 enormous aircraft carriers, floating airstrips packed with over 400 fighter, torpedo, and bomber aircraft. The world was about to witness the most spectacular example yet of a new form of warfare at sea. Japan may have been a country steeped in tradition, but when it came to naval warfare, it was one of the most advanced nations in the world. And the man at the forefront of all this was the Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was a great visionary and modernizer. He was a pioneer of naval aviation. and had been quick to grasp the potential of aircraft carriers, the latest weapon in the naval arsenal. Yamamoto could now use warplanes on these carriers to strike at targets hundreds of miles away from his fleet. By 1941, Japan had around 3 times more carriers in the Central Pacific than the Americans. Yamamoto had created a formidable carrier force capable of pursuing Japan's imperial ambitions. And by Sunday, the 7th of December, 1941, 6 of his aircraft carriers were in position, ready to mount a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor.
The Japanese were battle-hardened veterans. They'd been fighting to extend their Asian empire for years. The men on the aircraft carriers were at the peak of their skills. Each of these Japanese aircraft carriers were crewed by up to 2,000 highly trained servicemen. Their job was to support squadrons of elite pilots who'd spent years in combat missions flying bomber and fighter aircraft. These naval aviators were among the best in the world. They'd never been defeated, and in the early hours of the 7th of December, they were only 2 hours flying time away from Pearl Harbor.
Every significant American installation on the island of Oahu would come under attack. The Japanese strike force would make a landfall on the island's northern tip, Kahuku Point. Here it is on the map case. Yamamoto planned to send in over 350 warplanes from his carriers in 2 ways. The first would veer off west, hugging the ground to achieve maximum surprise. The second wave would swing round from the east. Yamamoto's aircraft would go for the major air bases dotted round the island, to annihilate America's planes on the ground before they could take off. But this was his prime target, Pearl Harbor, where the pride of America's Pacific Fleet was tightly clustered, utterly unsuspecting what was about to come.
On board the carriers, the pilots put on fresh uniforms and their traditional headbands. They had a ceremonial meal of rice and said their last prayers at the shrines on board. Minutes later, they were off, the crews of the ships lining the deck, waving and cheering.
Listened to the radio. The American stations were broadcasting normally, so it seemed they were not aware of anything. And then I knew that it was going to be a sneak attack.
The attack on Pearl Harbor was scheduled for 8 a.m. Here at Pearl Harbor that Sunday morning, the main event on many sailors' minds was the flag-raising ceremony. It was the same every time. At 7:55 a.m., ships' companies gathered, and 5 minutes later, the flags would be raised right across the fleet. On board the USS Nevada, tied up here with the other battleships on Battleship Row, a band was gathering on the deck, preparing to play the national anthem. It was now just moments before 8 a.m. The USS Nevada, the bandsmen, still halfway through the national anthem, were horrified to see a Japanese plane release a torpedo at a nearby battleship, then peel off, strafing their ship, splintering the deck and shredding the flag. Under fire themselves, the bandsmen finished the national anthem and then dived for cover. Airfields, barracks, and all of America's great battleships came under attack. Just after 8 a.m., a bomb smashed into the USS Arizona, igniting the ammunition store. Down below decks, over 1,000 men lost their lives.
The devastation was just unbelievable on those battleships. You think they're big, heavy, a lot of heavy steel and all that. When you see those superstructures just twisted, big hunks of steel that were twisted just like you take a straw and twist the thing, I couldn't believe the amount of devastation that I saw.
America had lost the best part of its Pacific fleet. The Japanese had sunk 21 ships, like this one, the Utah. All 8 of the big battleships were out of action. Hundreds of planes had been destroyed, and nearly 2,400 servicemen and civilians had been killed. By attacking Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had made a declaration of war without parallel. The next day, the American President, Franklin D. Roosevelt, addressed the nation.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
America was down, but not out. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, a new man was put in charge of what was left of America's Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz. He was sent here to Pearl Harbor by the President himself. His orders? Not to return home until Japan was defeated. Nimitz was an experienced commander who'd proved his ability to instill confidence in his men. But he had an enormous task. Morale had plummeted, hundreds of planes had been obliterated, and all the battleships of the Pacific Fleet were out of action. But Nimitz held one ace card. By chance, every one of the aircraft carriers in America's Pacific Fleet had been out of port at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor. They were now all that survived of the main striking force America had in the Pacific. These carriers and their aircraft would now take on the Japanese.
In spring 1942, the Americans began their comeback with a daring raid using their aircraft carriers. On board, a handful of US pilots, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, were taken deep into Japanese waters. This Doolittle raid involved 16 of these bulky B-25 bombers. They weighed more than 12 tons each. They really weren't designed to take off from aircraft carriers. But for this mission, the bombers were transported on board the USS Hornet within about 700 miles of the Japanese coast. Then at 8 a.m. on April the 18th, carrying as little weight as they could, they moved off along the runway, just managed to take off and headed towards the Japanese capital. For hours, Doolittle and his men flew low over the ocean to avoid the patrolling Japanese planes. Then, when they got to Tokyo, they dropped their bombs. America and her aircraft carriers were beginning to fight back. And just over 2 weeks later, having attacked the Japanese mainland, the US Navy took on the Japanese Navy at sea.
On May the 7th, the American aircraft carriers made their presence felt again when they engaged with Japanese carriers in the Coral Sea, just northeast of Australia. The The battle saw the first ever attacks by carrier-based planes on their opponents' carriers, and both sides were hit hard. The Americans managed to sink a small Japanese carrier. But the Japanese destroyed one American carrier and left the other, the USS Yorktown, in flames out at sea.
The Japanese had left the USS Yorktown ablaze in the water. They thought that they'd sunk her, or at the very least crippled her and put her out of action. But what they didn't realise was that there had been a ferocious struggle to save the Yorktown. With one carrier now destroyed, and only a few others operational, every carrier the Americans had left was vital. They had to save the Yorktown. For crews like the Yorktowns, hundreds of miles away from land, knowing how to tackle fire was essential if they were to save their ship. I went to a naval training centre to experience for myself some of the challenges faced by the Yorktown's crew as they struggled to extinguish the flames.
You want to put your hat on?
Yep.
And we'll go up onto the unit. Okay, so this is a replica of a ship. Okay, we're now in the engine room, and this is where you're going to be doing most of your firefighting. Okay, you're going to make your entry down this vertical ladder.
Okay.
However, before you come down here, you're going to have to put the fire out on top. Fire you're going to be fighting today is going to be this engine fire here.
This is all like warped and melted and cracked from the heat. That's not making me feel too confident about it.
No, I mean, it shows just how hot this fire is going to get. And you're going to be the first one down here, and you're going to be providing the protection for the rest of the team. It's important that you get it right, because the rest of the team are relying on you to get into position to protect them from the rest of the fire as they make their way down there.
So it's a real team job.
It is definitely a team job. Okay, I'm going to do the straps up. Okay, pair of gloves.
I'm lucky. I'll be using much more advanced kit than that used by the Yorktown's crew at the Coral Sea, but it's still a daunting task. I'll have the key role of spraying a wall of water to protect my teammates from the flames. We'd all been briefed in advance, so I knew to take up my position next to the door. But I still didn't really know what I was in for. Wow, that's hot! Those flames are enormous! Okay, I'm going in. We put out the first fire with the foam. I'm now going to be the first one down into the engine room itself. I knew there would be an intense fire below me in the engine room. With the metal walls heating up all around us, we'd literally be descending into an oven. The men on the Yorktown would have faced a similar challenge as they battled to save their ship.
I'm going down this ladder. I'm trying to take it slowly because it's very, very slippery because we've thrown so much water and foam down here. It's incredibly hot. I'm at the bottom of the ladder now. I'm just going to set the hose up like this in a wall, shield of water. Pressure on this hose is huge. You know, just seeing these explosions, these fireballs are coming, I can almost reach out and touch them. But this shield of water that I'm putting up, this wall of water, is so effective that the fireballs aren't actually getting through it, but it's pretty intimidating being this close to fire.
The thought of doing this for real on a carrier like the Yorktown loaded with aviation fuel and ammunition was terrifying.
I can really understand what I'm doing here now, and the rest of the team can go try and get to the base to try and put it out. All hydrants!
did you find that? Incredible. Was that hot? Certainly feels warm. Okay, just hang on a minute. That's it, well done. Just get your hood down. Okay, you alright?
Yeah.
Well, you managed it. You achieved the aim.
Ooh, it's pretty hot in there in that last room.
Yeah?
You feel pretty self-sufficient in there. If you don't put the fire out, no one else is going to. And I guess on board a ship, that's an incredibly powerful feeling.
You're on your own. You could be 150 miles from land. You're on your own. It's your team. They've got to get down there. They've got to put that fire out.
Things were no different in the Battle of the Coral Sea back in 1942. Although she had been severely damaged, the desperate work of the crew had saved the Yorktown. In the coming weeks, this would prove to be a crucial victory. The Yorktown would return to haunt the Japanese. But in the meantime, she began a long, slow journey back to Pearl Harbor for repairs.